this is a player that feels like he's going to work in Bill Self's system. He feels like a guy that's going to be somebody that can earn Bill Self's trust quickly because he's going to do a lot of little things, right? You don't play 40 minutes, all 40 minutes in 7 of the final 8 games of the season for St Bonaventure without doing all the little things, right? Pay heed all who enter and beware this podcast. That's right. This is the Pay Heed podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer. I'm here with Kevin Flaherty, and we have some breaking news. Breaking news. Kansas basketball has landed another transfer portal commit, and we are going to talk about all that, break it down, talk about the roster, where it sits now with this additional commitment, and maybe a couple other names to keep an eye on potentially as well as Kansas continues to navigate through the transfer portal as they look to build their roster heading into 2025-2026. As a reminder, you should subscribe if you have not already on Apple, Spotify, on our audio platforms, or on our YouTube channel. Make sure you have that notification bell turned on so you know when we drop episodes like tonight for breaking news in this particular case as Kansas lands a commitment. So make sure you're subscribed, drop a comment on YouTube channel, leave us a 5-star rating and review, share your thoughts. You can find us also on social media at PayHeatKCSN for our podcast account. You can find Kevin at KFlaherty KCSN, myself at Nick Springer 29. So lots of ways to get connected with the show, lots of ways to get in touch with us. We love hearing from you folks, and thanks so much for your support if you have already done all those things. And if you haven't, what are you waiting for? Subscribe, please. And stay tuned for all this great content we have coming your way. All right, let's dive right into it, Kevin. Kansas lands a commitment on Wednesday night as we record about 7 p.m. They get the commitment from Melvin Council Jr., 6'4" guard out of St Bonaventure, a guy that we have highlighted a couple different times on this show, somebody that we expected Kansas would have on their radar and would go after pretty intensely. He was on a visit this past weekend to Kansas, left his visit, and eventually decides to commit to the Jayhawks. Before we start to really break this down, a couple things I wanted to point out here. First things first, this was what Bill Self had to say in his little statement release on Melvin Council Jr. He said, quote, "We're very excited to announce Melvin Council Jr. has signed." Self said, "He's a 6'4" long rangy guard that can play with the ball and without the ball. Melvin will remind our fans physically and athletically of Tyshawn Taylor. He's a superior athlete who can score the ball and has the potential to be one of the more elite defenders that we've had in recent memory." So, Kevin, before we even started recording, I know you had mentioned you kind of loved that comparison to Tyshawn Taylor. What do you think of this commitment for Kansas?
Yeah, it's funny. I think everybody wants shooting in the portal, and Council isn't a shooter. And so there are going to be some people that may look at it and maybe not be as excited. But the thing that Council does extremely well, that Tyshawn Taylor did really, really well, is he puts pressure on the rim with his athleticism, with his explosion. He's a guy that can get to the free throw line. He's a good shooter once he gets there. We talked about on a previous episode, Nick, how, he shot right around 30%, I think, from three. If you're looking for maybe a reason, I don't want to say to be bullish on the shooting, but to feel like, hey, maybe this is a guy that could shoot, Division I average, somewhere around there. He is a good free throw shooter. And a lot of times that's something that we circle and track in terms of, hey, if a guy's a good free throw shooter, a lot of times it's not necessarily the mechanics that are the issues, and it's something that you can iron out a little bit. But beyond that, Nick, one of the things that we had talked about too was just how indispensable he was for St Bonaventure. They could not take him off the court. He played just about every minute for them in conference play, and that included playing all 45 minutes of an overtime game for the Bonnies. And so when we were talking about Council versus, like Xavier Lee, when we were looking at it, I had said, Lee was maybe the guy that I kind of preferred from a talent perspective if everything worked out. This is a guy, though, Nick, as you made the point, I don't think there's question of if he's going to work out, because this is such a Bill Self guy.
Well, just to underscore that, when Melvin Council announced his commitment on Instagram, he said one of his favorite lines. This is from Melvin Council himself. Quote, "I've got to say my favorite line. If you want to be a dog, you got to be a dog. Because if you're not a dog, you're dog food." And if that doesn't sound like a guy you want on your side fighting for you on your team, I don't know what does. And that really epitomizes exactly what you just said, the point about this is a player that feels like he's going to work in Bill Self's system. He feels like a guy that's going to be somebody that can earn Bill Self's trust quickly because he's going to do a lot of little things, right? You don't play 40 minutes, all 40 minutes in 7 of the final 8 games of the season for St Bonaventure without doing all the little things, right? Without being, unselfish with the ball, without playing defense, without hustling, without making all those little plays at that level. And so, yes, absolutely. I think that's my biggest takeaway is this is a player that absolutely is going to fit into Bill Self's system. And this is what we've talked about this whole offseason and even going back into the season when having these conversations about the transfer portal, right? Sure, it's easy to look at a guy that shoots 40% or 35, 38% plus, whatever, and say, hey, that's a player that we want to use. Or look at a guy that averages 19 points per game, 18 points per game. Hey, that's a guy we want. With Bill Self and the way that he coaches, that stuff is not as important. What's more important is having a player that he can trust and be able to put on the floor, because it doesn't matter what the stats are for some of those guys. When they've gotten to Kansas, it hasn't worked out for one reason or another. And the bottom line is because that's just they don't fit in with the system that Bill Self has. And we talked about it. Bill Self's system is great if you're taking a player and developing him and building him up, where it's maybe a little bit flawed. And maybe one of the reasons why KU struggled in the transfer portal at times over the past couple of years is it's not great at taking players that are already developed players and molding them to the system. It's clearly shown that that's not what it's really the strength of it is. So what do you need to do? You need to go find players that are already molded to fit the system that you play. And I think a player like Melvin Council is absolutely that way. He is absolutely a player that is going to fit into the Self system and be somebody that can be leaned on early and often in his Kansas career. So absolutely, he's again 6'4" guard. He's going to be playing that two spot. He's incredibly athletic, a very explosive player, as you said, Kevin. If you turn on his highlights, it's all basically getting to the rim, making plays at the rim. Yep. But he's also a really strong passer as well. Actually, one of the had a higher assist rate as well at St Bonaventure. So again, a guy that I think can do a little bit of everything. And again, if you want to look at weaknesses, the 3-point shooting maybe is a little bit of a weakness for him, but I think absolutely everything else significantly outweighs that for Kansas in terms of bringing him in, because he is a player that is going to, I think, impact the game in a lot of different ways, and somebody that can be relied on early on once he gets to campus.
Yeah, well, in the comparison that I would even make, I mean, if you leave Tyshawn Taylor as kind of a best case, and I know Self said Kansas fans are going to be reminded of Tyshawn Taylor in these specific ways. He wasn't saying, hey, this is Tyshawn Taylor, reincarnated or whatever. But if you look at something else, and this is something that we've talked about, Nick, look at Shaq Moore and how indispensable he was when he was healthy. And Council, is 6'4", but brings a lot of the qualities that Shaq Moore did defensively. He's also a guy that is going to rebound, that's going to pass at a higher level. He's more of an offensive threat than Shaq Moore was. And so if you were to say to somebody, hey, how do you feel about adding a plus Shaq Moore even, I think most people would say, yeah, sign us up for that one.
It's also become very obvious that Bill Self had a specific type of player he was looking for at the guard position. When you think about Jaden Dawson and then obviously Darren Peterson, I think Bill Self looked around and said, we had DeJuan Harris, we had smaller guards over the past couple of years with like Zeke Mayo and Diggy Coit and even Shaq Moore to a certain extent last season specifically. We had more smaller guards, and I think he looked at that and decided, you know what, let's try to change that, right? Let's try to get bigger at that position. And boy, has he certainly done that with Darren Peterson to go along with Jaden Dawson and Melvin Council. You're talking about 3 guys that are 6'4" plus that are going to be playing your 1 and 2 spots probably a good chunk of the time. And then you throw in Marco Jackson as well. So I think it's pretty clear that Bill Self had a type and knew what he was looking for in the transfer portal, which I think is also another positive, because in previous years, I think it's been a situation where Kansas has maybe grabbed at what they saw first and looked at best available and just went with it. And this year, there seems to have been a much more measured approach and a much more focused approach as well on this is the type of player that we want to get. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because when you have a player like Darren Peterson, a guy who is going to be a one and done, why not have it? Why not go out and pinpoint exactly the type of players that you want to play alongside him that can be successful?
Yeah, one of the things that I thought was really interesting on the women's basketball side was When we talked to Brandon Schneider before the season, he talked about how he had been building the roster around Samaya. And Samaya obviously is somebody that was going to stick around for a few years and whatever else, but a similar type of thing where you've got your foundational piece, you know what that foundation is, and then you try to build a roster that's going to work around them. The thing with Council, he and Peterson are going to put so much pressure on the rim on offense, and then you throw in a guy like Dawson, who is a guy that can really shoot, really space the floor, out to 25, 30 feet in some cases, but also is a guy that's comfortable shooting off the dribble, Nick. And so he brings that as well. You look at what else you'd want. Okay, you want somebody who's going to be a good cutter that can do a lot of the little things. And hey, that's Trey White. You want a big man who's a lob threat, and Flory was already there, but they made sure they brought Flory back from the transfer portal, and Flory is going to be really good at that. And so when you're looking at this, I really do feel like the roster is starting to take shape. I would still caution anybody away from feeling like this is it, right? Like that you're going to just get role players or whatever else. It is still my belief, Nick, that Kansas's leading scorer is probably going to be Darren Peterson. But the second leading scorer, I still believe, is not on roster yet. And so I think that's something to keep an eye on, because I do think there's one more starter at least that Kansas is going to go out there and add, and potentially even multiple starters. And so I like the pieces that they're adding around. I like the way that they fit with Darren Peterson, and like the way they fit with Flory as well. I would also just say, hey, this thing isn't done yet. Like, don't go to bed tonight feeling like, hey, we've seen the best part of the portal or the best part of next year's roster, because I still think there are some pretty loud pieces out there that have yet to make their decision that could kind of change this Kansas team in the way people perceive it.
And we're going to get into that a little bit more later on in the show with some possible names to watch or thoughts that we may have more on that as well. Also want to talk a little bit more about Melvin Council, the player, what he brings to Kansas, and plenty more on this breaking news episode. But first, let's take a quick break, and that gives us, of course, the opportunity to remind you that you should shop at Home Field Apparel. To get homefieldapparel.com and use that promo code PAYHEAT24, 15% off of your first order over at homefieldapparel.com. I mentioned it on the previous show. They've got a baseball drop soon. And, of course, Kansas baseball is having a major series coming up this weekend in Lawrence with Kansas State coming to town for the Sunflower Showdown. Probably the most anticipated Sunflower Showdown series in baseball in as far as I can remember. I mean, I'm not sure, but very exciting. General admission tickets are already sold out. They're in the process of possibly adding more. All I can say is if you are planning on going to the games this weekend for Kansas baseball, get there early. Number one, get there early. And number two, make sure you're wearing home field apparel. And you can use that promo code PAY24, 15% off your first order at homefieldapparel.com. More KU basketball talk is coming up next. Looking for tickets for your next event? Tickets for Less is your number one source. Save big on every purchase when you use promo code KCSN at ticketsforless.com.
Success in real estate takes more than vision. It takes the right financial partner. When someone takes something rundown and turns it into something great, that's called a comeback story, like Brain Group. They take distressed properties here in KC, completely rework them, and then turn them into valuable real estate. But that kind of work needs the right bank behind it. Enter Emprise Bank. They're not about cookie-cutter loans. They saw Brain Group's vision, backed them, and now they're making big moves in Kansas City real estate. Talk about your partner in possible. Emprise doesn't do one-size-fits-all financing. They invest in potential and back growth. Visit emprisebank.com/KC to learn more. Emprise Bank, member FDIC, equal housing lender.
Are you ready to win some real cash during the basketball playoffs? Well, check out Pick 6 from DraftKings. When it comes to basketball payouts, DraftKings Pick 6 posterizes the competition. And yeah, that includes prize picks. Hit all your picks and score higher minimum payouts on Pick 6, plus even more cash if you outscore the competition. Pick 6 is available in most states, including Missouri, California, Texas, Georgia, and more. New players get 50 in Pick 6 credits instantly on just a $5 entry. Here's what you got to do. Download the DraftKings Pick 6 app now and use code KCSN. That's code KCSN for new customers to play $5. Get $50 in Pick 6 credits. Better payouts, bigger wins, only with Pick 6 from DraftKings. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org in Connecticut. Must be 18 plus. Age and eligibility restrictions vary by jurisdiction. Pick 6 not available everywhere, including New York and Ontario. Void where prohibited. 1 per new customer. Bonus awarded as non-withdrawable Pick 6 credits that expire in 14 days. Limited time offer. See terms at pick6.draftkings.com/promos.
This is the paid podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer with Kevin Flaherty, a breaking news edition of the show on this Wednesday night as Melvin Council Jr. from St Bonaventure announced earlier in the evening his commitment to join Kansas for the 2025-26 season. And this is such huge news, such big breaking news, folks, that Kevin is actually on vacation and he is so dedicated, so committed that he is still with us here tonight to break down this commitment. So shout out to Kevin.
You're not a dog, you're dog food. So, we had to make sure this thing got shot.
Kevin absolutely has that dog in him, and 100%, no questions about that. You did kind of touch on something that I wanted to expand upon a little bit more here right before the break earlier, which is Melvin Council and where he fits in, right? We talked about what this team's going to look like in 2025. You've already got 2 starting spots nailed down, I think, at this point with Flory Badunga and Darren Peterson. I think I look at Trey White, and maybe you could pencil him in at the 4 if you want. But is Melvin Council a player when you add him? Is he a guy that you expect is going to play starting level minutes? Or, I mean, obviously he's not going to play every minute of every game like he did at St Bonaventure. But I guess, do you have an early expectation maybe for what he could bring from that standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, he's going to be tough to take off the court. And so whether he's a starter, whether he's a 6th man, I do think that he plays starter type minutes, to your question. I don't know. Kansas is going to have some interesting roster questions just in terms of, hey, when El Marco comes back, what level is he going to be at? Because he was somebody that, as we've talked about on here, the buzz on him coming out of the spring was really positive. And so, you're hoping that he's able to take a step forward after coming back from that injury. If Kansas goes out and gets another win or 2, it could impact that. But Jaden Dawson's a guy I think with the way this roster is coming together, I think his shooting it. And I think one of the things that gets undersold with Jaden Dawson a little bit is that he's got an overall scoring package. He's a thickly built guy who can defend as well. If he locks in on defense, I think both he and Council, it may be one of those where, hey, this guy plays 23 minutes, this guy plays 21 or something like that. But I think that those guys could be kind of fun to be on the court together, but also are 2 guys that it could be very difficult to make sure that they don't both play at least 15 minutes a game, if not more.
I know we're sitting here in the middle of April, but you mentioned something there. Is this shaping up to be one of the better already defensive teams, possibly,
sure,
if they reach their ceiling that you've seen in recent memory?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And like we said when he came back, the linchpin to all that was Flory, because Flory allows Kansas to defend in a way that it hasn't been able to probably since Doak. And obviously that Udoka Azubuike team in 2020, they were elite defensively. They actually weren't a team that packed the court with shooting, but you knew every game that they were going to come out and lock you down, and that Udoka Azubuike was going to be really tough to stop on the other end. You knew Devon Dotson was going to push the ball up the court after misses and really get out into transition and pressure you, put pressure on the rim. Sounds a little bit familiar so far with this team. And so I do think that they need to continue to add shooting to this group, Nick. But to your overall point, I think that's one of the undersold parts of Darren Peterson's game is I think he's just really competitive. And so whether it's rebounding, whether it's on defense, he competes. And so having a guy like that as sort of the tip of the spear as your point guard, and having Flory on the back line that you can do kind of whatever you want with, because he's going to block shots. He's going to move his feet. You can have him high hedge if you want to. You can change things up with Flory because of his athleticism at that 5 spot. And then you add in a guy like Trey White, who's a plus defender. You add in a guy like Dawson, who I think can be a good defender. You add in a guy like Council, who could be the best defender on roster. I mean, Flory might be a little more impactful just because we've seen big man defenders are typically a lot of times more impactful at the college level, but Council could be the best defender on this team. And so like you said, this is shaping up to be a team that, even if they don't light the baskets on fire every night with the way that they currently are, they are a team that can turn off the hose at the other end.
Well, and Council can be a scorer as well. Average almost 15 points for St Bonaventure. And again, just something that I do personally with players of this caliber when maybe they're not at a Power 5 level is just see how they performed against Power 5 or equivalent level competition. And when you look at St Bonaventure's schedule last year, they didn't really play a ton. They did play Providence in a game in which Melvin Council had 24 points and was actually 2 of 3 from 3. They also played VCU, who ended up being a tournament team. He scored 20 points in that game on 7 of 17 from the floor. They ended up going to the NIT. They also played VCU again in their conference tournament, and he had 19 points also in that game. So, yeah, this is a player that absolutely can score as well and has that capability as a driver. We talked about his 3-point shooting a little bit, maybe not being one of his strong points. Another one is just maybe off the dribble shooting is not necessarily something that he's super strong at, but in this scheme with Bill Self, I don't think he's going to be asked to do that very much, right? I mean, I think typically if you're expecting a guy to be shooting off the dribble, it's probably going to be Mr. Peterson, I think, doing a lot of that. So I don't think you're going to have to be focused too much on him having to do something like that. But it is nice to have a guy that can handle the ball, right? I mean,
yeah, for sure.
Is not going to be able to play every minute of every game. So you absolutely want somebody else that can handle the ball, whether that's Marco Jackson, depending on how he recovers from injury, but having another player that can handle it as well is certainly a positive also.
Yeah, I think so. And when you look at the way KU runs its offense, right, it's typically been at its best when you've had secondary ball handlers, whether that's been KJ Adams even in stretches as the short ball creative guy, or whether it's been a more traditional guy. We've talked about the 20 team earlier in this episode and before. People forget that Marcus Garrett actually led that team in assists in Big 12 play. And so when you look at that, not only did you have Devon Dotson, who was your point guard, you had somebody else out there that was capable of handling the ball, coming off the weave, coming off dribble handoffs or things like that. And so Kansas's offense is at its best when you've got multiple guys who can create. And I think that that's something that they've done a really nice job of getting a couple of those guys early on. I do think, and I'm sure we'll talk about it here a little bit more, there are a few holes you'd like to see filled in, not even necessarily in the starting lineup, but maybe a couple archetypes you'd like to still see. I still think maybe landing like a true point guard who could come in and, run your offense for the rare moments when Peterson is not on the court, maybe wouldn't be the worst thing, potentially an actual stretch four type guy, backup big man, etc. But overall, Nick, I'm liking the way this roster is coming together.
Yeah, that's interesting to mention that. I mean, with this addition, you now have a stable of 4 guards, basically, right? With Darren Peterson, Marco Jackson, Council, and Jaden Dawson. Do you think Kansas should be looking for another potential guard player to add to that?
I think there are some guys out there that would make sense, but I think it needs to be the right fit. And I think Kansas has found out the last few years, unfortunately, how quickly your roster can thin out. One guy gets hurt, one guy has something happen, whatever, and all of a sudden you're feeling really, really thin, and you're not sure how you're going to make it through. And so that's the tough thing about today's college basketball, right? It is in the transfer portal and all these things. Nobody wants to come be the number 5 guard, but chances are you're going to need your number 5 guard at some point. And so it's not an easy spot to fill. And I think that when you when you go out and look, that's maybe a position where you really do have to evaluate the character as much as the other stuff, because you have to determine, hey, is this a guy that not only, I don't want to say he'd even be willing to be the number 5 guard, but is he somebody that is going to be ready when his number is called, even if it hasn't been called a ton up to that point? And I think that when you look at the 22 team, when Remy Martin went out in conference play, Yesufu probably doesn't get enough credit for stepping in and playing as much as he did in that spot. And then you get to the NCAA tournament, and Yesufu didn't really play a major role, but he was important, right? You maybe don't get a number 1 seed if, Yesufu doesn't play those minutes through conference play. All of that adds up. And so I do think that that's a spot that I would like to see them add to, Nick, but I also think that it's a spot that you have to be very careful kind of about who you're adding and what their mentality is going to be.
If I'm not mistaken, Joe Yesufu had a huge game against West Virginia, I think, during that stretch that helped Kansas win, I think ultimately win that game as well. So, yeah, I mean, this is a situation where it's an all hands on deck situation, right? You don't want to, I mean, we look back, Bill Self talked about it. KU had, with Kevin McCullough in 2023, maybe the best starting 5 in the country, but injuries and lack of depth really, really sunk them, right?
Yeah.
And so you absolutely want to make sure you have, a stacked cupboard, for lack of a better term, of guys that you can bring in and have some confidence in. And that's really what it comes down to is getting players that not just fit, but also are guys that Bill Self is going to have confidence and faith in, right? I mean, we haven't talked about it in a while, Kevin, but the Bill Self circle of trust still exists. And
it will always exist.
And if you're not a player that's going to be able to get into that, i.e. AJ Storr, then it just becomes that much more difficult to be somebody that can be relied upon. And again, with Council, I think it's absolutely the case that he's somebody you can rely on, and that's the case. By the way, shout out to AJ Storr, committed to Ole Miss, by the way. So that's his 8th school in 8 years, I believe, or something like that. So best of luck to him. Obviously, I hope he does well. But yeah, AJ Storr goes to Ole Miss. And I believe Ryland Griffin is still uncommitted at this point. So
yeah, I think so. Yeah. Although it does look like a few KU players could be tracking to Miami, and I think he's one of those.
Yes.
Yeah.
Could be teaming up with Ernest Uday also. So
I believe Rakees Passmore is maybe a possibility.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. Is it the Miami Jayhawks or is it the Kansas Hurricane?
All I know is Bill Self played 3-dimensional chess, sending Charlie Moore to Miami eventually, from his previous teams, and that helped KU get through the Elite Eight. And so it would be really funny if Kansas wound up beating Miami in the NCAA tournament, where Bill Self had a double agent or two on that team.
That's hilarious, because you could feasibly do that. You could do hey, go into the transfer portal and just if you go in conference, just scout every team and just tell us what every team is doing in conference. That is actually not a terrible idea. So we'll keep an eye on that one. We'll keep an eye on that one. Okay, we're going to take one more quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about a little bit more about the roster and more names to watch. Kevin mentioned some different positions that KU may still be looking at. We'll get into that a little bit more and where KU kind of goes from here. So we'll talk about all that coming up next.
Thanks for listening to KC Sports Network. Make sure you download our new app. Find it on the App Store or Google Play. Just search KC Sports Network.
This is the paid podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer, along with Kevin Flaherty. If you haven't already, please subscribe. Apple, Spotify, on our audio platforms, wherever you get your podcasts, on our YouTube channel at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN. Drop a comment, share your thoughts. You can also leave us a 5-star rating and review. You can find us on social media. Lots of ways to get in contact with the show. We love to hear from you folks to give your thoughts on where Kansas basketball sits at the moment. So please do all that good stuff. Please subscribe. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your enemies, tell anybody about us, and tell them to come on over here as we'll give you more great Kansas coverage over the course of the rest of the spring and into next season as well. So really appreciate everybody hanging out with us as always. So Kansas adds Melvin Council, and Kevin, you kind of touched on a little bit early in our previous segment about what maybe more Kansas is going to look for. I 100% agree with you, by the way. Kansas is absolutely not done. I mean, they need to fill more spots. They have more spots available. So this is just another addition in a line of falling dominoes for Kansas this offseason. They've already gotten so now they're up to 3 transfer commits with White, Dawson, and Council. And I think it's realistic. You could expect them to add at least 2, probably 3, maybe even 4 more players, actually, out of the transfer portal when you consider how many players departed from the program. I guess you could, I don't know, can we call Floyd Badunga a transfer portal addition? I guess.
You could for sure. For sure. I think we said it on the Flory show. That was the most important addition that KU would make in the transfer portal in this class. I mean, even if KU winds up getting some of the guys that they're looking at in the portal who would be big-time guys, I have a hard time seeing Kansas being successful this year without the combination of both Peterson and Flory.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. I mean, he's the guy that there is absolutely no way you were going to find a player with an equal ceiling to him, I think, in the transfer portal. So definitely agree with that. You talked about the possibility of Kansas looking to add another point guard potentially. And you also mentioned the possibility that Kansas' second leading scorer may not be on the team yet. And I may tend to agree with that a little bit. We actually had somebody on our YouTube channel commenting about Cedric Coward, the 3-man out of Washington State, a very interesting player in the sense that he was having a really strong start to his season this past year, averaging over 17 points per game for Washington State, and unfortunately suffered a pretty significant shoulder injury and was sidelined for the remainder of the season with shoulder surgery. He's also a player that is potentially investigating going to the NBA draft. I believe if you look at some mocks, he's in the mid-second round range right now, I think, for Coward. But he's a guy that, again, coming off of a major injury, major surgery, but was obviously very, very successful early in this season for Washington State. Yeah, is he a guy, Kevin, that you think may fit into this puzzle for Kansas possibly?
Yeah, absolutely. You're looking for guys who can shoot like we talked about, and guys who can do something also when the shot isn't falling, when they're not scoring. I think Coward fits both of those, to be honest with you. He actually blocks shots at a pretty high rate for a 6'6" guy. But the big thing there, Nick, I mean, he was a guy that shot, I think, over 90% from the free throw line a year ago, was shooting 40% from 3 this year, obviously only in 6 games, but I think he was at 36% or something like that a year ago. And so when you look at that, you're adding a 6'6" guy that's going to defend, who's going to rebound, do a lot of those things. But more importantly, he could be sort of that second leading scorer. It wouldn't surprise me at all if Kansas was able to add Coward, if Coward was the second leading scorer to Peterson. I think he's got that to him. He's a guy that can score in a lot of different ways. Got to the free throw line. By the way, Nick, making 2 threes a game, shooting 40% from 3, pretty good. His free throw rate in those 6 games was 50%. So, I mean, talk about getting to the free throw line, in a smaller sample size, but somebody that can grind out and get to the free throw line as well. And so Coward would be a big plus addition. He would be somebody that I would expect would plug into that starting lineup pretty quickly and easily. And then to your point, there's another interesting guy who's not a portal guy that I think a lot of people are going to be following a visit this weekend very, very closely.
That is true. Yeah, that's a good treasure. One quick note on Coward is you mentioned the free throw shooting. What was one thing Kansas struggled with this year? Getting to the free throw line. Now, obviously, the major concern there, I think, is coming off that major shoulder injury, and we'll see if he ends up going through the NBA draft process, what that may play out as. But yeah, you teased it. Kansas, they got the number 1 player in the class of 2025 in Darren Peterson, the number 1 player in the class of 2026. Tyron Stokes is going to be on campus for KU in Lawrence. Now, this is not a player. I currently am not under the impression that he is somebody that would reclassify. I think a lot of folks jump on that immediately when they see like this. If you remember, I believe Chris Johnson who ended up going to Texas, was a top player, and there was the same conversation. He visited Kansas at one point during the spring of his recruitment, and there was a lot of conversation about what do you reclassify, what do you reclass. So it's not a guarantee one way or the other. This is not one that I get the impression he would. I wouldn't be surprised though if Kansas would pitch that to him.
Well, I think you put that perfectly, because he has said in interviews and everything, no, I'm not reclassifying. And so when people are like, hey, what's your source on this thing? Well, the source is, Tyron Stokes talking about his own recruitment. But I think there are some things that do make it at least a little bit intriguing. He's not playing grassroots basketball over the summer. And so I think some people have said, well, if he's not doing that, could that lead into it? His age is at a point where he would still be eligible, I believe, for the 2026 NBA draft, even if he were to arrive a year early. So that would be something as well. And even beyond that, you hit the biggest nail on the head, Nick, which is, even if he's saying no, when he comes on that visit to Kansas, I'm sure Kansas is going to pitch him on saying yes. And I think that's not to say that he's going to change his mind, but it is something to keep an eye on, that Kansas has a really intriguing pitch, right? Hey, the potential number one pick in the NBA draft would be your point guard. This would be the guy you'd be playing with if you came if you came this year. That would obviously transform Kansas's roster if he were to go ahead and reclassify. As of this point, though, like you said, he has said he's not going to, but there are a couple things out there that do, maybe, even if he hasn't left the door cracked a whole lot, there are some things out there that maybe would encourage people to leave the door cracked. And I'm sure Kansas is going to try and sort of kick that door open and explain to him why that would be a really good move for him to not just come to Kansas, but come to Kansas for the 25-26 season.
Well, and beyond that, he would be a perfect hand and glove fit for the starting lineup at 6'6", right? Like that's that wing position is the biggest hole, right? We just talked about Cedric Coward. RJ Lewis is a guy we've talked about a number of times that I have a lot of interest in. That's the biggest hole right now in this roster. Is you need a bona fide, legit wing, probably that can be a bit more of a scorer also. And Stokes would check some of those boxes as well.
He's a 3-4 guy, which is awesome and exactly what they need. Like, he's one of those guys. He's too powerful for threes. He's a thick body guy. He's listed, I think, 6'7", 245. Has really good length. Is a really good athlete, so he can hang with threes athletically, and he can overpower them. Well, then when he plays the 4, he's got the strength to hold up against 4s, but he's way quicker than the 4s that would be defending him. And so, he's, wherever you play him at, he's a mismatch for one reason or another. There's a reason he's the number one player in that 26 class right now.
Yeah, and like I talked about, I think one of our earlier on portal shows, the biggest need on this roster, by my eye, really for the last 3 weeks, has been that position, a bona fide wing scorer type. And it just so happens with the way things have unfolded that that's a position where there are some players that are looking at the NBA that, it's just been a bit of a slower burn at that spot, specifically for what Kansas is looking for in terms of a real impact player. So I think that's why I mentioned it. When you look at what Kansas done at the guard position, obviously Melvin Council, you look at what they still need in terms of adding another big man as a backup to Flory. Those are also, important things to do. The starting 3, I think, is still something that remains at the top of the list. It's just so happens that it's probably going to take a little bit more time. This is not something where I think within the next week or so, you're going to see Kansas get the guy that they're looking for at that spot because of a variety of reasons that I outlined, right? I mean, you have Tyron Stokes, who, as you said, Kansas, I'm sure, is certainly going to pitch that to him, even if it's not necessarily plausible at the moment because of what he said, or not necessarily something that he's interested in. We'll see. I mentioned a guy like Coward is somebody who's going to probably extend well into May and beyond because of the NBA draft. RJ Lewis is another guy that's like that. So there are some players out there that I think Kansas would be and certainly probably is interested in, that it's just going to be a slower burn at that particular position for what KU is looking for. And then beyond that, you still do have some time. I mean, the transfer portal stays open through the weekend. So you still have a couple days left for possible players to still enter in. that Kansas may go after.
Yeah, for sure. And we've said this on previous shows, but remember, like they can exit the portal whenever, right? They can make their decision whenever they want to. That's the deadline just for them to enter the portal.
Yeah.
And so don't freak out because the portal is closed and you're like, oh my gosh, they still have 4 need. No, once guys are in, they're good to go. Like you don't have to worry about that part of it. But we've said for a long time, Nick, that probably at least one KU player for next year's team is going to be somebody that goes through that NBA draft process and winds up picking the Jayhawks later on down the line. And so Melvin Council, great get, would want him on my team no matter what, and is a guy that really fits what Bill Self wants, fits that mentality. I also think that Kansas still has some pretty big cards left to play in this cycle.
Yeah. We talked about the NIL spin for Kansas. Think there's still an opportunity there for Kansas to go big potentially on one more player if they choose to. But again, I personally love that it's more of a slower burn. Like I would rather it be this way. I would rather there be a little bit more time for evaluation, time for all that type of stuff. I think that's good for Kansas because jumping the gun, I think in some cases and spending a lot or whatever it may be for players, I think sometimes can not work out as well as what I'm happy with seeing Kansas do so far. And I think so far up to this point, in terms of what Kansas has done in the transfer portal, you have to be pretty satisfied. I think you've gotten 3 really quality players that are guys that are going to fit into the system and be impact players with Jaden Dawson, Melvin Council, and Trey White.
Yeah, and I think we talked so many times this season, Nick, that it almost got tiring about how passive this Kansas team was. How, they would play at sort of whatever tempo the other team wanted to play at. There wasn't really something where they imposed their will on somebody. And when you look at Kansas's additions for next year, I think maybe the common thread is that Kansas is building itself to attack, right? They may not always be the most skilled team out there. They may not have the best shooting roster in college basketball, even by the time it's all said and done. But right now, based on the guys they have, Nick, they're building a team that's not going to be dictated to. They're building a team that's going to dictate to other people what they're doing. And obviously that would be a return to the way that Bill Self wants to play as well.
Yeah, and that also is something that stands out, what you said there at the end, returning to the way Bill Self wants to play. I think with DeJuan Harris and KJ Adams, you hitch your wagon to them if you're Bill Self and just kind of had to ride it out essentially, with 2 guys that, again, you got to love their contributions to the Kansas program. You got to love their heart, their tenacity, right? But this year you're going to see a very different version of Kansas, maybe one, again, more akin to some of other teams we've seen for Kansas in history under Bill Self. So, which I think is an exciting prospect. So, Kevin, you got anything else to add here before we wrap up the show?
No. A good night. Good night for them to add a key player. I think Kansas fans are going to really enjoy Melvin Council Jr. I think he has a chance to be a fan favorite on this year's team.
Well, speaking of fan favorites, we hope that we are your fan favorite. I almost got that backwards. Well, you're certainly our fan favorites if you're listening to this, but we hope that we are your fan favorite show as well, covering KU. And if we are, let us know, subscribe, drop a comment on audio platforms, leave us a 5-star rating and review, all that great stuff. Really appreciate you as always for joining us. Big shout out to Kevin for doing this from his vacation. Shout out to Kevin as well for doing this breaking news show from his vacation. But until then, I'm sure we'll be talking plenty more transfer portal stuff. We're going to be talking some more KU football as well, as we still have some position breakdowns to get to also. So you'll definitely want to stay tuned to our feed for more great content coming your way. But until next time, he's Kevin Flaherty. I'm Nick Springer. We'll talk to you again soon. See ya.